So now what? Donald Trump has made history, becoming the first current or former U.S. president to be convicted of a felony crime, 34 felonies to be exact, in the hush money trial in New York State. The big question, what kind of an impact, if any, will the verdict have on voters here in Minnesota and across the country?
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. What was once unthinkable, a convicted felon running for president with a very good chance of winning, is happening. One poll taken after the guilty verdicts in New York shows Donald Trump in a statistical tie with Joe Biden, with Trump leading Biden 44 to 43%. Now, that's exactly the same result that very same poll came up with when they surveyed people before the verdict. But some polls taken after the verdict indicate a conviction will cut into Donald Trump's support. In one poll, 10% of Trump supporters say they are now less likely to vote for him. And in an election that looks like it is going to be once again very, very close, any loss of support for either candidate could decide the race. Tonight, you will hear from two veteran political scientists and two partisan activists, one Republican and one Democratic. First, let's start with political scientist, Professor Larry Jacobs. Well, joining us right now is Professor Larry Jacobs of the Humphrey School. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be with you.
All right. What are your thoughts about the impact of this verdict on Trump's candidacy and how many votes he's going to get?
I think it's something we're going to have to closely watch over time. What we're seeing so far is that there's a majority that agree with the verdict of guilty, but we're not seeing a whole lot of change in terms of the horse race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It looks pretty much the same. It's a close race. And I'm not sure it's really going to change very much. There's very strong support for President Biden among Republicans, and that doesn't appear to really be shaken very much. So at this point, I don't think there's a big impact.
And looking back at history, how extraordinary is that you've got somebody who has been convicted of 34 felonies who still has a very good chance of winning the presidency?
We're in new territory here. We've never had a president who was brought to trial and then convicted. This is all brand new. I think the key thing in this race is you've got Donald Trump, who's well known. I mean, people have a history with the January 6th events. He's been impeached twice. He's kind of scarred up quite a bit. It's not like there's a big revelation here that's shaken people from their support. And then there are some real concerns about the economy, inflation, immigration, that I think are giving people pause about President Biden.
Yeah, I think some people like me are looking at the polls and trying to figure something out. One poll that was taken after the verdict shows essentially the same thing, basically a tie, 44% for Trump, 43% for Biden, which is a statistical tie. But what I also find interesting is the polls that were taken right before the verdict, asking Republicans if it would change their vote if he was convicted. And an ABC News Ipsos poll said, for example, 80% said it wouldn't make a difference, but 16% said it would make them reconsider, and 4% said they would withdraw their support. If that holds, that would make a difference. I mean, that would be it, wouldn't it?
Sure. Any change, even a small change, would tip this election. If you go back and you look at the 2020 election, basically 55,000 votes out of 158 million made the difference in that outcome. So yes,
in 3 states.
And yeah, a very few number of states. So, a small difference will tilt this election. But I'm cautious about, situations that give a hypothetical to voters.
Sure.
If there's a conviction, how would you respond? It's just many times we see voters, once they're faced with a concrete situation, and the case of Republicans, they're wrestling now with their loyalty to the Republican Party, their deep discomfort with President Biden. I just don't think we're going to see a tidal wave or even necessarily a significant shift against Donald Trump.
I've been doing a little side project for the station where I've been going to different communities and talking to voters. So far, I've been to Anoka, Northfield, and Pine City. Pine City and Anoka, obviously Republican areas. And what I'm really struck by is that when you ask voters what the issues are that they are worried about, 9 out of 10 will strongly say the economy and inflation and prices and grocery prices and gas prices. And that's what they're talking about. And they're giving the marks to Trump. It was a different time 5 years ago. Do you see that changing, or is that going to have to get better to boost Biden?
I think that's locked in. I mean, I think particularly among Republican voters, their negative assessment of Joe Biden is sunk. I would not expect a big change in that. I don't think the trial is really going to, kind of uproot those people and make them seriously consider even cast the ballot for Joe Biden. This is probably going to be a very close race, decided, by a few percentage points in a handful of battleground states. And Minnesota may be one of those battleground states this year.
Right, because we could be up in the air. Well, Larry Jacobs, thank you so much. We certainly appreciate your joining us.
Good to be with you.
Coming up, our Republican and Democratic strategists. Well, joining us right now is Amy Koch, Republican analyst. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this verdict, is this going to make a difference for Republican voters?
Right. Well, it does appear for at least, I think the numbers were around 10 to 15% of Republicans saying this conviction will matter to them. Which,
and those polls have been sort of national polls. Do you think in Minnesota that'll be the case too?
I think the numbers will hold. Right. So the question on the conviction is, right, there's those folks that absolutely believe this is a witch hunt and they're not changing their minds. Then you've got the folks on the left that are, getting a tattoo of the judge on their arm. They're not changing their minds. So like it's the folks in the middle that matter, right? The what do they call them? The double haters, the folks that don't like either of these guys. And so like, who will they get out for? I think largely they'll stay home, which is helpful to former President Trump. But if even 10% of Republicans kind of making a final call to say, no, I just cannot support President Trump is problematic for him, not in just Minnesota, but nationally, because the margins are going to be so thin. And so I would assume those are kind of the Nikki Haley voters that have been sort of, am I or aren't I? And some of them haven't decided. Maybe even some of them said, well, this does seem a little bit like a witch hunt. It seems very political and blown out of proportion. But there's a group of them that are saying this is just too embarrassing. You can't do it. And
you brought up Nikki Haley voters, and that's the question I wanted to ask, because in these primaries, and primaries have been going on for the past few months. I know most of this is tuned out because it's pretty much decided. But I think it's amazing that 15, 20, 10% of people, Republicans, are voting in primaries for Nikki Haley, who's not even running anymore.
Sometimes even over 20.
Where do those people go? Because that's a big chunk.
It is a really big chunk. And some of them will go Republican. They'll just decide, listen, I cannot stand what the Democrats are doing. I'm just going to hold my nose. But some of them won't. And the question is, do they vote for Biden or do they actually just not vote? And if they just don't vote, I think for President Trump, I mean, obviously he would prefer they vote for him, former President Trump. But if they don't vote, it's a cost. It is the same for Biden with like the progressive left that are very upset about Gaza, right? There are folks that call him on the left Genocide Joe. So will those folks eventually say, oh, I just can't have Trump be it, so I'm going to hold my nose and vote? Or are they going to walk away? And I think in the case where it's the Nikki Haley voters or those voters that walk away from Joe Biden, I think that hurts obviously it hurts whatever candidate they might ordinarily vote for.
I've been doing a series talking to voters in different communities, and among the Republican areas I've been to is Anoka and Pine City. And what I'm hearing really is that people don't seem to care about Trump's, although this is before the conviction, about Trump's legal problems. They don't really care about the war in Gaza. They're not bringing that up. They're not even bringing up abortion. What they care about is that the prices at the grocery store are a lot more expensive, certainly than they were 5 years ago and even more expensive than a year ago.
Right. Well, and we all thought that that was going to be the 2022 defining moment. It wasn't, right? It was
Right.
very close to Roe
That's
versus
a good
Wade.
point.
And so I think that everybody thought that would. So can that sustain this time? I think maybe, because gas prices just have not abated. Grocery stores have only gotten more expensive, even from where we were 2 years ago. And at some point, that's just really weighing on families' pocketbooks. It just has to go this long with that kind of expense. So.
Are a lot of Republicans, even people who are saying, "Hey, go President Trump," is there a lot? Are a lot of them conflicted deep down or privately?
I think so. I think it's difficult. And again, it's not all. There are folks that are, absolutely 100% in this corner. But I think that there are also a lot of Republicans that are just, standing back and saying again, they don't like the woke nonsense. And it's fascinating to me to watch the Democrats sort of like do things that really put them at odds with independent voters or sort of less MAGA voters, where they could pick up those votes, and they just absolutely refuse by doing super lefty progressive things that are unacceptable, right? It seems like this should be an easy win, and it's not at all. In fact, right now Trump continues to lead very narrowly in the poll
Yes. In all the polls that have been taken since this verdict.
since the verdict.
Amy Koch, thank you so much, as always. Great to talk to you.
Thanks.
Well, joining us right now is Democratic analyst and strategist Abou Amara. Thank you so much for coming on, Abou.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
All right. Your thoughts about the verdict and what kind of impact it's going to have, or what kind of impact it's not going to have on voters across the country, but also voters right here in Minnesota.
Yeah, so on one level, I mean, obviously, this is one of the most consequential things that's ever happened in our democracy. A president has been convicted of a felony. And so on that level, it's kind of a really earth-shattering moment. But when you get into the politics, I'm not so sure it's going to be this watershed moment politically. I do think it's going to impact a couple of places. Georgia, some of the polling coming out of there shows it might have an impact, and in Arizona. It's not going to fundamentally change the map, but in a couple of places, it could make a difference.
And isn't that's pretty extraordinary to have a conviction not make a difference? What are you seeing that makes you think that it won't make a difference? Because there are an awful lot of people who are seeing this the way you are.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at some of the support within the party, which is often a good indicator about how strong you are in the general election, Donald Trump is still polling about 85, 90% of Republicans. And if you're being convicted of a felony and you're still going to have 85 or 90% support of your party, it shows you're going to be fairly strong going into the general election. Now, I think this is obviously a good thing for Joe Biden and his team to be able to effectively prosecute. Why? This is not just a question over policy. It's really about, can we have a convicted felon in the White House, or should we have 4 more years?
Well, that's obviously one of the questions. I mean, one of the big questions is, can Trump win with just Republican votes?
And Democrats understand the answer to that is absolutely not. Donald Trump knows part of why he lost in 2020 were independent women in the suburbs. And obviously, he didn't do as well with that demographic. This is the type of thing that doesn't help that. And so, Donald Trump's going to have to figure out, how can he grow? He can't just get the folks he got in 2020. That won't be enough. He's got to get more. This is not going to help that.
Well, those votes in the suburbs, especially women, I don't think are, if 2022 was any indication, aren't going to gravitate towards Republicans because of the leftover anger over the Roe v. Wade being overturned. I mean, is that still a flashpoint?
I think it's definitely a flashpoint for those women and for that voting bloc, right? So Donald Trump, I think, is going to try to change the question altogether try to make it about the border, try to make it about the economy and other things, because he knows that's probably fertile ground for him. But again, in the suburbs, you've got voters who are going to be turned off, not just based on abortion, although that's still an issue, but on a conviction. To have a convicted felon, I think that's something that's going to be hard to swallow for that key demographic of voters. And I think it's going to make a huge impact in Georgia and to a lesser extent in Arizona.
Sentencing for Trump in this case is mid-July. Do you think what the sentence is will make a difference? I mean, most people, most legal analysts, and I know you are obviously an attorney, don't think he's going to get prison time. What do you think the sentence is going to be, and do you think the sentence will have any impact on these voters, this voter support issue?
Yeah, so I agree. I don't think he'll be sentenced criminally to jail, anything like that anytime soon.
And is that because in other cases, people are not, first-time offenders are not sentenced to jail? It's not just because he's Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think there's two pieces. I think first is exactly what you just said, right? He's a first-time offender. He's a senior. It's a nonviolent crime. These are all mitigating factors for why you wouldn't sentence somebody to a jail sentence. But second, the reality is he's the Republican nominee for president, and I don't think folks are interested in having a Zoom presidential campaign where someone's sitting in jail for the next 3-4 months. I think it's going to be him on the campaign trail. But it's also possible that they stay the sentence, and what that means, they basically say, look, we'll put you on probation, we'll pause it, we will back in 6 months or a year and reassess what the sentence will be. That's also an option.
Which would be extraordinary if he does in fact win.
Which would be extraordinary if he wins, because ultimately what that does is infinitely pauses any type of imposing a sentence until after he would be out of office.
All right. And then the other trials look like they could begin after the election, which is after he could win. I mean, the bottom line is really he has a very good chance of winning still, wouldn't you say?
Structurally, there's no question that Donald Trump still can win this race. I will say, though, every day that we've gotten closer to election day, the polling has started to either flatline or to trend slightly in Joe Biden's favor. This is an example of something that's going to be important. Okay. Debates at the end of the month. I think the debates of the month are going to be important for Joe Biden if he wants to be able to pull away and get some momentum on Donald Trump.
Okay, but that change in the polls is tiny, teeny. I mean, it's moving at a snail's pace. We'll have to see. Abou Amara, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, political analyst and constitutional law professor David Schultz on not just the political, but the legal fallout post-conviction. Well, joining us right now is political analyst and constitutional law professor at Hamline University, David Schultz. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Esme. Thank you for having me.
All right, we're talking about the consequences of this conviction of Donald Trump on 34 felony convictions, 34 counts. What are the legal consequences and the legal impact? Is he still able to run for president?
Yes, he can still run for president of the United States, but he's going to be running as somebody who's a convicted felon. And the reason why I mention that, even though Donald Trump has indicated that he's going to appeal the decision, there's no way that a court of appeals in New York is going to render any type of decision on an appeal before election day. Just not going to happen. I mean, I would not anticipate any type of decision, if at all, before, let's say, 2025. So he does run as a convicted felon at this point. He's allowed to do so. The question becomes, are there other sort of problems attached to this? For example, many people have asked the question, can he still vote? And it appears that he can, unless he gets incarcerated.
Yeah.
Donald Trump,
yeah, it appears that there's a loophole in Florida law that because of the crime occurred in another state, he can't vote. This had all gone down in Florida, as I understand it. He wouldn't be able to vote.
absolutely correct at this point. And so because the conviction is in New York, he again, unless he actually gets incarcerated in New York, which again is also a low probability at this point, he's going to be able to vote.
Okay.
Another thing to be thinking about here legally, what's next? Okay, his sentencing isn't for about a month. What's going to happen is that he's going to be subjected to what's called a pre-sentencing report or investigation, where they interview him, they interview others, and a recommendation is made by the New York City Department of Probation regarding a possible sentence.
And this is something that happens to every defendant after a conviction. And that pre-sentence evaluation is really a big deal. I mean, judges take it very seriously. Now, I've heard analysts say that in comparable crimes in New York State, for a man of his age and a first-time offender, that this would not be getting you prison time, even though it's 34 felony counts. What are your thoughts about that?
No, you're absolutely correct at this point. He has There's an age factor. It is a first-time offense. And also, this is a non-violent offense. Yes, it's 34 counts, but you put all those together, it's incredibly unlikely that he or any similarly situated defendant would receive any time in terms of actual incarceration. More likely, it would be a combination of some type of fine and probation, but pretty low probability in terms of actual incarceration.
Okay, but probation would mean checking in with somebody. He'd have to go to a probation officer every few weeks, or at least let him know. I mean, in terms of travel too, there might be travel restrictions possibly, right?
Yeah, absolutely correct. In terms of being on probation, among things, for example, a passport would be lifted so you couldn't flee the country, standard procedure. You would have to get permission from probation officers in terms of leaving the state whatsoever. And so there'd be significant restrictions there. But I'm also going to throw a different one in here. If he were actually elected president of the United States, there are several countries in the world, including Great Britain and Canada, that do not allow convicted felons into their country. So one would wonder if he actually were elected, and he can be elected even as a convicted felon, would that place restrictions upon his ability to leave the country? And could he get into other countries to perform, let's say, presidential duties?
Wow. Obviously, from the polling, and the polling's been a little bit different here. One poll taken completely after this conviction shows exactly what it showed, Morning Consult, the same numbers, 44-43, Trump, Biden, which is essentially a tie. There were polls taken before the conviction that indicated that Republicans, that there was about 20% of Republicans that would have mixed feelings about this. Maybe 16%, according to one poll, would rethink it or revisit it, and 4% would not support him. If that happens, what are the consequences?
Well, it all depends. That's a great question here. Would these people say they're eventually not going to vote for Donald Trump? Would they go over and vote for Joe Biden? Would they stay home on election day? Or would they vote for a third party candidate such as RFK Jr.? All of them are possibilities. And it's not necessarily clear that these voters who say that they won't or are less likely to vote for Donald Trump as a result of conviction, it does not necessarily mean it's going to work to Joe Biden's advantage. But the
All right.
polling numbers,
Well,
as you point out here, are so involving so few people, and so few people are going to determine in the swing states the election here. You only have to move a few people to really affect the election.
well, Professor David Schultz, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you, Esme.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, feel free to email me with any comments or suggestions at esme@cbs.com. The show streams every Wednesday and Thursday night on CBS News Minnesota at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. On Fridays, the show posts to YouTube for on-demand viewing. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.